Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where each story glows with the quiet light of the past, and each silence hides a secret, yet untold. Tonight, we bring you another tale from the golden age of detective fiction. The Earl's Silent Dinner, a full-length Hercule Poirot mystery written in homage to Agatha Christie's world of civility, secrets, and the subtle poetry of truth. So pour a cup of warmth, settle beside the fire, and let the evening unfold. It was the sea, I think, that first made the silence seem like a presence. Windmere Hall rises from the coastal cliffs as though it had been hewn from the very storm, a sombre geometry of stone and window light, all of it gazing down upon a moaning black sea where white foam claws the rocks and falls away again, unheeded. We arrived beneath a sky the colour of pewter. The rain came slantwise and urgent, each drop a tiny messenger tapping upon the carriage roof. The trees, twisted with salt and years, leaned as if bowing to some ancient lord whose command none dared disobey. This, I was told, was the night of the Earl's silent dinner, a tradition dating back to some medieval vow of penitence or pride, depending on one's source. For the length of the meal, not a word would be spoken, not by the master, nor the servants, nor guests of honour. It was, so the old story went, the reminder of a debt never named and a secret never confessed. I confess that to an Englishman of my cheerfully conversational habits, the notion of an enforced hush at supper seemed both barbarous and faintly comic. But then, as the carriage rounded the final bend and Windmere Hall loomed, each window a rectangle of candle flame, each gust shaking the ivy against the stone like 1,000 whispering fingers, I felt the odd solemnity of it press upon my chest. There was a moral sentiment in the air that I could not define, an atmosphere in which fear and pride were cousins, and where guilt, if present, would wear a very respectable dinner coat and a perfectly tied cravat. The Earl of Windmere, I gleaned from our previous correspondence, was a gentleman of the old stripe, keen on his family's dignity, keen too on the careful choreography of public life at the edge of empire. Yet rumours had drifted down coast and inland, debts, discontents, a quarrel with his son, a second marriage not universally admired. The village at the foot of the cliff, all slate roofs and stubborn hedgerows, repeated these tales as if they were prayers for stormy nights. Poirot, naturally, was indifferent to rumours. He sat beside me in singular stillness, a tiny valise upon his knees, his hat precisely angled, his moustaches immaculate, as if the weather of England were an impertinence he would not dignify with a twitch. "Mon ami," he said at last, in that delicate voice, "listen to the rain. It tells us the whole story, persistent, insistent, and yet it obscures as much as it reveals." He tapped the window once, a gentle punctum, and smiled. Silence, you see, is not only the absence of sound, it is sometimes the arrangement of it. We stepped down upon the gravel drive. Somewhere within the hall a clock chimed the half-hour, its note swallowed immediately by the wind. The great door opened, and warm light spilled out, turning the rain to quicksilver. It was a house prepared for ceremony. But as I crossed that threshold, an image rose unbidden. A dining table gleaming with silver and crystal, faces lifted, hands still, a bowl of waxen fruit beside a candelabrum, and behind it all, at the far end, a man who had decided long ago that some truths should never be voiced. In that moment I felt cold in my bones, though the fire burned high. A silent dinner, I thought. What could be safer than silence? I had yet to learn that under certain roofs, silence is the most dangerous guest. Chapter 1. The Harrow and Net. A public house with beams the colour of old tobacco, and windows that gathered the sea mist like lace, had its own catechism for nights such as these. Men who had spent their lives passing the moods of water spoke in levels of hush and certainty that would have suited a chapel. Women, shawled against the damp, offered the sort of tidings that arrive as gently as a rumour and lodge like a thorn. Windmere Hall's lamps, visible as a string of amber buttons along the cliff, were cause enough to draw eyes. That it was the night of the Earl's silent dinner made the watching steadier, the comments sharper. "They keep the vow, then," said an elderly fisherman, who wore his cap like a crown and balanced his opinions with the same ease as he did a net. "For a wrong done to the blood. That's why the sun goes about as if chased by his shadow." "The wrong," replied the landlady, polishing a glass to brightness, "is always with the one who can afford to name it. Don't be romantic, Mr. Ford." A small laugh went round. "Yet beneath it was the ache of affection I have observed in English villages for their lords and ladies, an ambivalence plated from envy, habit, and a very real love of home." At the hall itself we moved as though upon a stage where the scenery bore secrets in the grain. The great dining room, which I had only glimpsed during the introductions, opened now with all its ceremonial splendour. A table as long as a cricket pitch, candles in regiment, and the silverware stretching out like a disciplined army. Servants moved in a ballet of glances and tiny bows, the only language permitted, until the tradition had run its course. The Earl presided. A figure out of an etching, he carried himself with that paradox of fragility and command which old soldiers sometimes possess. He did not, to my eye, enjoy the ritual. He endured it with a form of ascetic precision. The Countess, delicate and poised, wore a smile arranged like an ornament. Viscount Arthur's attempt at nonchalance looked like restraint nailed to impatience. Lady Evangeline at the far end had a stillness I could not read. Reverend Mallory's expression served parish discretion, Dr. Percival's medical decorum, and Miss Doria Vale, so tidy, so spare, kept her eyes on the Earl with the faintest anxiety of a secretary who measures not minutes but heartbeats. The first course came and went. So did the second. The silence deepened until it had a texture like velvet placed over the ear. I have never known the ordinary acts of dining to sound so treacherously loud. When a spoon touched a plate, the small ring travelled down the table as though it might announce a change in dynasty. Somewhere in the midst of this, the air altered. It was not dramatic, but just as a man who has spent years with fine cigars can tell the leaf by the ash, so too can the nose, if coaxed, draw significance from a breath. I caught it, faintly sweet, faintly bitter, a ghost of almond whispered to by sugar. A trifle, I told myself. Kitchen carelessness, a liqueur, the memory of a pudding prepared earlier in the day. And yet, when the Earl hesitated over his dessert, the spoon hovering as if above a question, I saw Poirot glance down the table with that peculiar attentiveness which is less than a stare and more than a look. After the dinner's formal end, conversation came flooding back with the fragility of a stream let out of a sluice. The effect was jovial and strained all at once. The Earl excused himself with a nod and a small smile and left for his study. I watched him go, noticing an oddness that would return to me later. He touched the breast of his coat lightly, as if to reassure himself of the existence of something within. We were shepherded to the drawing-room and did our duty to civility. If the Harrow and Net had been a chapel, then this was a salon for polite ghosts. The Countess spoke of a charity fete, and made a poised remark about the gales spoiling the bunting. Lady Evangeline inquired after a book I had not read. Arthur arranged himself at the piano and struck a few casual chords, but his mind was elsewhere. Reverend Mallory told a gentle story about a choir-boy who had mistaken a psalm for a shopping list. It gave everyone, briefly, a smile. Poirot sipped at a small cup of black coffee, admired its surface as if a painter had signed it, and set it aside. "The English," he murmured to me, "make bravery with jokes and grief with tea. It is a noble economy, Mr. Price, the butler, entered with that professional invisibility which is its own perfection. He moved towards Dr. Percival, bent, and whispered. I saw the colour leave the physician's already pale face. He stood at once. We stood with him. In the study, the Earl sat as though listening to the fireplace, the posture of a man who cannot quite rise. Dr. Percival knelt, his movements precise and spare, then stilled. It is a terrible thing, that stillness. It is the moment when the body becomes a room in which no one lives. The pronouncement came after a breath, the quiet regret, the apology without guilt, the words that fold a life and put it away. I will not pretend to heroics. I stared and felt the beating in my own throat, as if the drum of it might be heard outside. The Countess arrived, and with admirable composure asked no question she feared to have answered. Arthur's hand gripped the mantle so tightly that the muscle jumped in his forearm. Lady Evangeline stood very straight, as if taught young that posture is a kind of courage. Miss Vale, her composure fissured, made a small movement towards the desk, steadied herself, and withdrew. Mr. Price had the fixed attentiveness of a sailor sighting a reef. Poirot, who had waited on the threshold, entered with a courtesy that was almost priestly. He bowed his head slightly to the dead man, then allowed his gaze to travel. It moved as the tide moves, touching here, as if testing the shore. "The bell," he said. We looked. The small silver dinner bell that the Earl used to summon Mr. Price to the study, an heirloom with a coat of arms graven upon its curve, was missing from its usual place beside the blotter. A triviality, perhaps. Yet in a house like this, trivialities are rarely unaccounted for. Could it be in the dining room? I ventured. Mr. Price, affronted by the suggestion of disorder, replied with immutable gentleness. "No, sir. The bell belongs here." Poirot accepted the answer with a nod and stepped closer to the desk. He did not touch anything. He breathed delicately, like a man reading the air above a flower to know its name. Later, I would recall that he blinked twice in quick succession. It is a habit he has when a filament of thought catches on the hook. Dr. Percival straightened and spoke in the constrained tones of a man who prefers to be inconvenient rather than wrong. "We must inform the authorities." "Certainly," said Poirot. "But before the intrusion of the official bustle, a small order, if you please." "Madame," he turned to the Countess, "I ask only that nothing be moved, and that those who were at dinner remain within the house." "It is a storm," Mr. Price observed gravely. "No one shall be leaving." The Countess inclined her head. "We will do as you suggest, Monsieur Poirot." We were dismissed to the drawing-room with the peculiar freedom that follows a terrible event, no one quite certain where to put their hands or their sympathies. Conversation became a choreography of consolations. Arthur, who had gone white, then red, then white again, asked for brandy and did not drink it. Lady Evangeline requested a window be opened, then changed her mind. Miss Vale asked me, with a steadiness that looked practised, whether I had liked the quince. It was excellent, I told her. She nodded, as though a problem had been solved. The recipe is old. The Earl preferred old things, including silence, I said. Her eyes flickered. Especially silence? Poirot came to stand by the piano where Arthur sat with his hands hovering uselessly over the keys. "Monsieur le Vicomte," he said gently, "your father, he was well this afternoon." "As well as he ever is." Arthur gave a short laugh that was not laughter. "For a man who insists all is exactly as it should be." Poirot's head tilted. "And you?" "I," said Arthur, fixing his gaze on the polished lid of the instrument, "am as I am until I'm told I must be otherwise." It was not a conversation. It was a weather report, and the weather was changeable. When the village constable finally arrived, a competent damp man named Rowley, the formalities recommenced. Messages were sent, statements penciled. The wind leaned into the house and did not enter. In the midst of it, Reverend Mallory spoke not quite to anyone. "Dust thou art," he murmured, then coughed and made of it a cough. I stood, useless as a coat on a peg, and thought of the almond ghost that had crossed my nose like a shadow slipping into a hedge. It would have been simple to write it off as imagination had the missing bell not chimed its absence to my mind. A bell missing at the moment the Earl took his leave. A flavour just this side of fanciful. A tradition of silence which might conceal not piety but arrangement. Poirot came to my side. "You smell it too, Hastings?" I thought perhaps... "Ah," he said, with something like sympathy. The perhaps is often the first honest thing we say. He looked around the room, then, thoughtfully, towards the passage where the study lay in its new solemnity. The house itself seemed to contain its breath. "Who would steal a bell?" I asked, half in jest, half to ease the pressure in my chest. "Who indeed?" Poirot replied. "And why steal a sound unless you wish to control when it is heard?" His eyes, when they came back to me, were very bright. From somewhere behind us, a whisper crossed the air as thin as silk pulled over a ring. I could not have said whose voice it was. It was not the Countess nor Lady Evangeline, not Mr. Price, whose whispers are tools, not Dr. Percival, whose words come tidily even when quiet. A single name, almost not a name at all, brushed the edge of hearing. "Doria!" I turned. Miss Vale was by the doors, the lamplight shaping her profile into restraint. She did not look at us. "Did you?" I began. Poirot lifted a hand, and the gesture said what the vow at dinner had tried and failed to teach us, that there are times in certain houses when silence is not empty but full to the brim. Chapter 2. It is a curious thing, how swiftly a grand house rearranges itself after death. The servant's tread softens, the clocks seem to grow polite, and even the furniture develops a species of discretion. By the morning after the silent dinner, Windmere Hall had become that strangest of creatures, a palace in mourning that refused to look untidy. Poirot rose early, of course. He appeared at breakfast as if sleep were merely a hobby for less industrious souls. His tie was immaculate, his moustaches gleamed, and his small grey eyes shone with the serene light of calculation. "Mon cher Hastings," he said, pouring coffee with an elegance that mocked the British teapot. "You have observed how the English grieve? Always the ritual before the emotion. They lay the table for sorrow, but the meal, it is not yet served. I dare say that's a little unfair," I replied, buttering my toast. "We simply prefer to keep busy. It's our way. To keep busy is an admirable avoidance." He smiled kindly, not unkindly. "Today we must also keep busy, n'est-ce pas?" He spent the morning speaking first with the constable, then with the family physician. Dr. Percival, precise as a scalpel, reported his findings in the spare language of science: cardiac arrest, sudden and final. Yet beneath the formula Poirot heard dissonance. "You are sure there is no cause to suspect?" he asked, and the pause he placed before the last word transformed it from inquiry to invitation. The doctor hesitated. His heart was weak. "The symptoms are consistent with strain or shock." But not inconsistent with help, perhaps. The little push that turns misfortune into fate?" Dr. Percival's lips thinned. "If you mean poison, Monsieur Poirot, I found nothing conclusive." "Conclusive, yes. That most obliging word which keeps its secrets." He thanked the man with courtesy so dense it felt like fog, and went out into the garden, where the lawns sloped towards the cliffs. The sea was iron grey, the air full of salt and unspoken things. From the terrace the house looked almost innocent, as if architecture itself could plead ignorance. Poirot stopped, sniffed lightly, and knelt by the balustrade. Upon the stone rested a small smear, faint, yellowish, with the crystalline sparkle of something once dissolved and hastily dried. He touched it with the corner of a handkerchief, sealed it in an envelope, and smiled. "The scent of the almond, Hastings. It lingers where guilt dares not." The household, in obedience to the Countess's instruction, assembled in the morning room. I've never seen a group so simultaneously composed and fragile. The Countess presided as if holding together not a family, but a performance. Poirot began gently. "Madame, you were married to the late Earl for 5 years, yes? You found him, how shall we say, amiable?" She considered. "He was a man of habit, Monsieur Poirot." "Habits can be virtues or prisons. Aphorisms, madame, are admirable." "But I asked the small, precise question last night. Did you note anything unusual at dinner?" Her eyes flicked briefly towards her stepson. "Only the usual tension, monsieur. It was an old ritual and an old resentment. Arthur detests the vow of silence. He considers it a relic of tyranny." Arthur laughed sharply. "A vow of vanity, more like. My father enjoyed making others uncomfortable. It reminded him he was still the centre of his own legend." Poirot's head inclined. "And yet you obeyed the custom." "I had no choice." Arthur rose, pacing. "He would have disinherited me for less." "You speak with warmth, monsieur." "I speak with truth." He turned abruptly. "Do you suppose I'd wish him dead? I only wanted him alive enough to change his mind." Poirot said nothing, merely folded his hands, an expression of polite sympathy masking the alertness of a trapdoor spider. Lady Evangeline spoke next, softly. "My father was not unkind, but he liked to be obeyed. He called it order. Others might have called it fear." "And you, mademoiselle, you feared him?" "I feared what would happen when he ceased to be feared. It has happened." Miss Doria Vale, summoned last, sat very straight, her composure restored to factory condition. "I managed the Earl's correspondence. His instructions were precise." "I followed them," Poirot smiled. "And yet sometimes a secretary knows more than her master. It is the privilege of the efficient. I know only that the Earl valued discretion." "That's why I'm here." "Indeed? And tell me, mademoiselle, you prepared the seating plan last night?" "Yes." "The order of service?" "Yes." "The dessert?" She hesitated barely, but the hesitation existed. "The kitchen handled it." "Of course." Poirot leaned forward. "And the small silver bell, did you notice it missing before or after the dinner?" She blinked once. "I cannot say." "The Earl sometimes moved it himself." Poirot bowed. "Merci, that is most helpful." When she withdrew, he watched her go as if measuring the rhythm of her steps. "Hastings," he said, once we were alone, "observe the typewriter of the human being. It repeats its own misprints." "I'm not sure I follow." "You will." By midday, the formal inquiries had given Poirot 3 curiosities that he treated like beads on a rosary. First, the faint chemical scent upon the Earl's gloves, now sealed in an envelope. Second, a letter begun but never posted, discovered among the papers in the study. Third, the missing silver bell whose absence seemed to echo through every conversation like a note one cannot quite forget. The letter, written in the Earl's square hand, was addressed to Sir R. Mallory. The unfinished sentences read, "I can no longer remain silent. The debt must be cleared before the feast. You will understand why I chose this night." And there it ended, the ink blotted as if interrupted by a tremor or decision. Poirot studied it with reverence. "You see, Hastings, even a half-written letter confesses more than a sermon. This night," he writes, "it was deliberate. And the debt? Ah, that is the moral currency of England. Everyone owes, but few pay." The afternoon passed beneath the slow-moving clouds of grief and propriety. Poirot, never hurried, drifted from room to room as though following invisible music. In the library he examined the family portraits. Each generation, he mused, adds paint to the same expression. "The eyes, do you see? They all guard the same unspoken thing." In the dining room, he stood beside the chair where the Earl had sat. "The fish course, Hastings, always the fish." "You noted the odour?" "Yes, almond, faint but definite, just so." "And yet the fish was perfectly fresh, according to the cook." "The almond is a clue, mon ami, and almonds, you recall, have their dark cousin in chemistry." "You mean cyanide?" He nodded gravely. "The perfume of death masquerading as confection." He lifted the dessert spoon from the Earl's setting, examined the curve of the bowl, and traced its edge. A residue, minuscule, but sufficient for taste to betray none and time to betray all. Good heavens, I exclaimed. Then it was murder. Poirot replaced the spoon as though it were a relic. Murder, perhaps, but by whom and why through ritual silence? That, Hastings, is the question whose answer must walk in soft shoes. The clergyman received us in his small study overlooking the chapel yard. Books leaned upon each other like tired parishioners. I was his confessor of sorts, he said. Not formally, of course. Anglicans frown upon such intimacy, but the Earl trusted me. And did he confess anything of weight? Poirot asked. Mallory hesitated. He spoke often of legacy. He believed some sins are hereditary, that silence could be an act of mercy. Mercy to whom? To those who would suffer by knowing. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. And you, Monsieur le Révérend, did you agree? I believed him sincere. Ah, Poirot murmured, sincerity, the finest disguise when one wishes to lie even to oneself. When the interviews concluded, the day had turned to pewter again. Poirot and I walked the terrace once more. He stopped before the high window of the dining room, gazing inward where servants cleared what remained of last night's splendour. Hastings, he said softly, there is a geometry of guilt. It never balances unless one side is lighter than it should be. Last night there was one chair heavier than all the rest. I looked, bewildered. Whose? The one belonging to Madame la Comtesse. The Countess? But she seemed perfectly calm. Exactly, too calm. It is the tranquility of one who already knows the outcome. And yet, he lifted a finger, there is also Mademoiselle Vale. Two calm seas cannot occupy the same horizon without a storm between them. He turned the envelope in his hand. The one containing the faint yellow crystals. We shall let science whisper to us tonight. But even without it, mon ami, I smell the arithmetic of vengeance. We were silent then, listening to the surf beat its patient logic against the cliffs. I found myself remembering the Earl's half-smile, the aborted letter, the spoon gleaming like a question mark beside his untouched dessert. Poirot spoke at last. You see, Hastings, the English think silence is strength, but sometimes it is only the armour of the guilty. And armour, as every soldier knows, has joints. He turned towards the house, where light had begun to glow in the windows. Come, mon ami. We must dine quietly, of course. Perhaps tonight the silence will speak to us once more. I followed, uneasy, yet curiously certain that the next words uttered in Windmere Hall would alter its history forever. Chapter 3. By late afternoon the sea had lost its iron and taken on pewter. The horizon lay like a dull blade, and the wind pressed the hedges into attitudes of prayer. Windmere Hall, never a frivolous house, seemed to draw itself yet more tightly together, as if propriety could be made into a barricade. Within, clocks kept up their faithful fiction that order continues so long as someone announces it. Poirot and I stood in the long corridor outside the dining room. He had paused there of his own accord, his gaze half on the panelled walls, half on the tall clock that guarded the passage like a sentry. Observe, Hastings, he said softly, how the English house arranges itself along lines, time, ancestry, furniture. Cut one line and the pattern quivers. He had scarcely finished speaking when that very quiver came. The long case clock, a stately creature with a painted moon face, gave a tremor and ceased. The pendulum reduced itself to a sulky sway, then a single, elegant tick, then nothing at all. Its hands held at 13 minutes past 10, 10:13, I said, startled. Isn't that near the hour the Earl left the table? Near, yes. Poirot's eyes were not on the clock, but on the slim door that gave on to the chapel passage. And very particular, to halt a clock is to send a letter to the future, meaning we should discover who posted it. Mr. Price arrived, summoned by some domestic instinct that tells butlers whenever a house's heart misses a beat. "Most odd, sir," he murmured. "Not to me or to Poirot, but to the ether. Most odd indeed." "This clock was wound this morning." "By whom?" asked Poirot. "By myself, sir." "Then someone has interfered since." Mr. Price neither confirmed nor denied the insult to his jurisdiction. "I shall have it set right." "Touch nothing yet," said Poirot. And there was such tranquillity in the command that even a butler yielded to it. The corridor stretched away, a perspective of doors and oil portraits. At its end a small window framed the sea like a painting. Outside, fog was coming in, not thick, but resolute, a silver that would turn the lawns to theatre and the cliffs to suggestion. Poirot turned his head to it as a hound might turn to a scent. "Come, Hastings," he said. "We will pay our respects to the chapel." The chapel of Windmere was a modest thing, panelled and plain, with a single stained glass window that made a square of sanguine light upon the flagstones. It smelled faintly of beeswax and old books. Here the Earl had liked to sit, I was told, thinking whatever thoughts a man thinks when he stands between house and heaven. It was here, in the small stone font by the door, that we found the silver bell. It lay at the bottom like a drowned promise, wrapped in a strip of silk handkerchief and weighted by its own short clapper. The coat of arms, dim beneath the water, made our discovery indisputable. Poirot regarded it without surprise, so we put out a fire, and in the font we find the ember. "Hastings, do you see the economy? Water to bury a sound, but why hide it here?" I bent closer. The handkerchief, white originally, had taken on a faint yellow tint, as if something had bled into it that was not blood. A stitched monogram was visible at one corner. E.W.E. for Evangeline, or for Elizabeth the Countess? I asked. "Aye, for ambiguity," said Poirot. He took from his pocket a glass phial, and with Mr. Price's reluctant assistance in bringing a jug, decanted the water carefully until the bell could be lifted without touching its surface. He wrapped the silk in paper and sealed it fastidiously. "It is the second event," I said. "The bell's discovery. Surely it changes everything." "It changes only what the guilty imagined they had arranged. When the clock stops, the past interferes with the present. When the bell is drowned, the present attempts to baptize the past. But guilt, Hastings, is a poor theologian." We brought Mr. Price with us back to the study, where Poirot laid the parcel upon the desk as reverently as a collector sets down a rare book. He then asked that the Countess, Lady Evangeline, Viscount Arthur, Reverend Mallory, Dr. Percival, and Miss Vale attend. They came swiftly, propriety doing what grief could not. The Countess arrived first, composure gracious and immaculate. Evangeline, a paler echo, kept her eyes not on Poirot, but on the parcel. Arthur vibrated between offence and dread. Reverend Mallory had the truthful weariness of a man who has come to the end of his available wisdom. Dr. Percival, neat and spare, held himself as if ready to be consulted. Miss Vale had arranged her expression into a kind of observant efficiency that made me ache for her, though I could not have said why. Poirot, with no drama at all, unwrapped the parcel enough to show the bell within its paper cradle. "I find," he said, "that the household small herald has gone to ground in the chapel font." Arthur swore under his breath. "Who would put it there?" "The same who needed it not to be found where it should be. When things are drowned, they rarely ring again at once." Evangeline spoke, for once not soft. "The handkerchief. Whose is it?" "We will learn," said Poirot mildly. "For the moment we learn only that the bell which announces service, coffee, brandy, a servant, and interruption, was required to be absent from the study at a particular time. The time, perhaps, that the Earl returned from table." The Countess inhaled and let the breath go as if she had been practising that too. "We are to conclude, then, that my husband was murdered." "We are to conclude he was intended to die," Poirot returned gently. "Murder is a word best used at the end of a proof, not the beginning." "Intended by whom?" Arthur demanded. "By one who understands the habits of the house," said Poirot. "By one for whom the position of a spoon and the availability of a bell are the tools of an arrangement." We were dismissed. Or rather, they drifted away on the slow current of decorum. Poirot remained with me, folded the parcel once more, and crossed to the window. "The sea," he said, "is a great accountant. It balances everything in time. If we stood long enough, it would even up this matter without us. But I prefer a quicker arithmetic." "You suspect the Countess," I ventured. "Or Miss Vale." "I suspect," he replied, "the person whose conscience had to be persuaded that silence was a virtue rather than a strategy." "And who is that?" "Patience, Hastings. If I were a clock, I would tick. Fortunately, I am not." We spent the remainder of the afternoon in a kind of quiet pilgrimage about the house. Poirot would halt before some forgettable object with the attention one gives to scripture, then move on. In the small morning room, his fingers hovered above a blotter. In the library, he examined a candlestick with such care that I expected it to confess. And always he came back to two objects, the stopped clock and the silver bell. As dusk slid into the rooms and turned furniture to silhouettes, another ripple passed through the household. Mr. Price came to us with the hesitant urgency of a man who must deliver news he has not been authorized to possess. "There is talk below stairs, sir," he murmured. "The footman, Thomas, says the village is saying that his lordship was to change his will. A codicil, drawn up but not yet signed." "Gossip," I said, perhaps too quickly. "Villages always know what is not known." But Poirot's interest sharpened. "And who prepared this codicil?" The butler hesitated. "It is said Miss Vale typed it, sir." "Ah," said Poirot in that tone which suggests the tiniest of bells has rung in his head. "And where is this codicil now?" "No one knows," Mr. Price replied, with the scrupulous honesty of a man who could claim otherwise if he chose. "Or rather, several people know, each a different place." "We must ask the instrument itself," said Poirot. "Bring me, if you please, the typewriter from Miss Vale's office and a sheaf of her discarded carbons." Mr. Price bowed away with the gravity of a herald. When he returned, Poirot set to work not as a detective, but as a schoolmaster. He fed a sheet into the machine, tapped out a small alphabetical exercise, then another with a flourish, then a third with his name as a signature. He compared the impressions with a magnifying glass, smiling occasionally to himself as if the machine had told a joke he admired. "What do you learn?" I asked. "That the typewriter is a faithful witness, more faithful than its mistress. You see the misaligned E, always fractionally high, the faint chip in the R? It leaves a minuscule burr, like a broken tooth. If I find a document with such features, I have found the hand that held the machine steady. And the codicil? Exists because gossip rarely invents details about carbons. Whether it survives, eh bien, that is a question for love and fear to answer." We were still in the morning room when Miss Vale entered. She paused, saw the typewriter, and for the first time allowed emotion to find her face. It was not fear exactly. It was something more complex, a grief for an ideal perhaps, or the knowledge that efficiency, once her protection, had become a net. "I typed drafts," she said, without greeting. "At the Earl's dictation. He had not signed." "To whom did the codicil speak?" asked Poirot. She met his eyes. "To Fairness." "Fairness is a bag with many pockets, mademoiselle." "What was in these?" She folded her hands. "Provision for Lady Evangeline, directly, not through her brother. A settlement for the village, repairs to cottages, funds for the school." "A trust for—" She stopped. "For whom?" "For a child," she said, and colour touched her cheeks. "A child not officially of the house." Arthur's voice came from the doorway. He had come in without our hearing. "An illegitimate." "Good God!" Miss Vale stood straighter. "A living one? And who is the mother?" Poirot asked, very gentle now. Miss Vale looked at the floor. "The late Countess, Arthur and Evangeline's mother. Before her marriage, an indiscretion. The Earl took the child into the country quietly, to a nurse he trusted. Funds were to be arranged so that when the child was older, they might be educated and placed well, without scandal. He had put it off for years. We argued, yes, I argued with my employer, until he yielded. He meant to sign last night after the dinner, Reverend Mallory to witness. Mallory, who had followed Arthur, pressed his lips together. He told me as much. I had the pen in my pocket. Arthur looked as if someone had struck him and then politely apologized. He went to the window and for a long moment studied the fog, which had thickened into a soft erasure of the grounds. So that, he said at length, is the family debt. It is one of them, Miss Vale said quietly. And this child, where is he? She? Safe? Said Reverend Mallory, and the word had the sound of a priestly oath. And beyond the reach of our malice? Poirot folded his hands again. Then the codicil would have displeased some and relieved others. Monsieur Arthur, your inheritance would be lessened. Mademoiselle Evangeline, your independence increased. Madame la Comtesse, he glanced towards the door, as if she might enter on cue. Her position altered in ways subtle and not. Are you suggesting my stepmother? Arthur began hotly. I suggest nothing, said Poirot. I observe that when money and mercy walk together, their footprints are easily confused with those of pride. Night came sooner than I thought possible, the fog turning the window panes into mirrors. Mr. Price brought lamps, which set up small citadels of light in the rooms. In these islands we moved not quite secure. It was then that the second event acquired its twin. Thomas the footman, pale and determined, asked for Poirot at the library. We found him standing before the fireplace with the rigid innocence of a young man who has decided to tell the truth, though he does not know its size. "Begging pardon, sir," he said to Poirot, "but Mrs. Hargreaves, the cook, she told me not to come to you because it's the gentry's business, but I think it's everyone's business when someone is dead." "There was a bottle, sir?" "In the scullery. Not one of ours. I found it behind the sink after dinner, an ounce bottle with a chemist's label tore off. I said nothing because I thought I'd be blamed. I poured the dregs down the drain this morning, but I kept the cork." He produced it like a relic. It was small, stained faintly, and bore a printed scrap. "Need cyanide," I said, unable to keep the word from my lips. Poirot took the cork as one would take into one's hands a child's future. "You did wrong, Thomas," he said, with a kindness that did not let the truth away. "But you also did right now. Tell me, who had access to the scullery last night?" "Everyone and no one, sir. The kitchen was in a state. But Miss Vale—" And Thomas swallowed. The Countess came to ask Mrs. Hargreaves to prepare a tray for her ladyship's maid. Poirot looked almost amused, but there was no humour in it. "Bon, we have a bottle without a label, and a bell without a voice. We have a clock that refuses to lie. And now we must ask, who writes with misaligned letters upon the paper of destiny?" He dismissed Thomas with a pat on the shoulder and an instruction to say nothing further to anyone. Then he turned to us, his eyes alight with that inner illumination which in Poirot always precedes a revelation. "Hastings," he said, "do you recall the Earl touching his breast as he left the room?" "Yes." "And the bell being absent from the study when we entered?" "Yes." Then consider this. A man with a weak heart, accustomed to discipline, participates in a ritual of silence which he uses to control not only his household, but also his own fear. He leaves the table with a private intention, to sign a codicil, to ring for witnesses, perhaps to destroy a letter, perhaps to write one. If the bell is absent, he must go to find it or manage without it. Meanwhile, a spoon waits with a kiss of chemistry. Ask yourself, why both? Why a poison and a stolen bell? "To ensure the timing," I ventured. "To prevent him summoning help too quickly." "Reasonable," Poirot allowed. "But I think, too, it is to tell a story. The guilty narrate. They cannot resist it. And their story here is that the Earl died alone, a private failure, while a clock tells us he died at 10:13, when silence had reached its apex and ceremony its most brittle point. He drew from his pocket the envelope with the crystalline smear recovered from the balustrade.
This is not kitchen.
It is not scullery. It is a place where someone lingered and rubbed at their fingers in the dark. We were interrupted by a footfall light as thought. Lady Evangeline stood in the doorway, her face composed into its habitual reserve. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "may I confide in you without being noble about it?" Poirot bowed. "To be noble is to be intolerable."
Pray be honest instead. She shut the door.
"My stepmother feared the codicil," she said. "Not for herself. She has her jointure, but because she feared what the village would say if father's generosity became public. She clings to dignity as to a raft. She is not a murderess. She is a steward of appearances. If she touched the scullery, it was to ensure a tray arrived properly, not to season a death. And you, mademoiselle, did you wish the codicil?"
I wished the truth without the noise, she said simply.
"Miss Vale cares for the child. So I think did father, in his way."
"Arthur," her voice faltered.
"Arthur refuses the arithmetic in which love is not the same as blood. But he would not kill for it. Then who would?" I asked, more blunt than perhaps I ought. Evangeline looked at Poirot, not at me. The person who believes silence is the purest language. The person who thinks arrangement is the same as innocence. The person who loves order more than goodness. It was a strange speech, and it would have been obscure but for the way Poirot's head inclined just once, as if acknowledging a phrase he had been working towards for hours. He thanked her. When she had gone, he turned to me with a look that made my heart beat hard. "Do you see Hastings?" he asked softly. "The moral is older than the house. Pride borrows the voice of silence. Guilt borrows the hands of efficiency.
And love, love borrows the courage of scandal.
Between them stands a bell, a clock, and a spoon. And you know?"
I know enough to ask for all of them to come to the drawing-room after dinner, he said.
"We will wind the clock. We will set the bell upon the table.
And we will invite time to speak." His eyes went to the parcel again.
"One thing remains, the handkerchief. E.W., I said. Evangeline Windmere? Or Elizabeth, if the Countess's given name is Elizabeth.
Or even, he smiled faintly, Edward, if some gentleman borrowed it."
The initial is a fool's alibi." He lifted the paper-wrapped silk and held it close, not to smell but to see. "Here," he said at last, "is the revelation for tonight, the thread that will not be seen by those who do not mend." He pointed to the hem. A single stitch, unlike the others, sat slightly crooked as if made by a hand impatient to finish. Someone re-sewed this corner in a hurry. And that matters. How? "Because," said Poirot, "the guilty began with perfection and ended with haste. And in that haste they made the one mistake that even silence cannot conceal." He set the handkerchief down with finality, the way a man sets down an answer at the end of an examination. Outside, the fog leaned against the windows with a soft, steady will. Somewhere in the house, a servant closed a door, and the sound travelled like a decision. "Come, Hastings," said Poirot. "We prepare the theatre." And in that moment I knew that the next time the bell rang in Windmere Hall, it would not summon a servant, but the truth. Chapter 4. The drawing-room was arranged as if for an old-fashioned tableau, the great sofa like a dais, smaller chairs grouped in obedient arcs, lamps turned low so that faces carried their own soft halos. Beyond the windows the fog leaned against the glass, making the night a private audience. Poirot had prepared his theatre with the economy of a composer. On the central table rested the silver bell, polished and grave within its paper cradle, the handkerchief dried and folded, and a small mantel clock wound to the minute, its tick precise as a heartbeat. Mr. Price stood a little back, his proper post, while the family and their intimates were seated. The air, which had for 2 days been full of dignified sorrow, felt now like the breath held before a verdict. "Mesdames et messieurs," said Poirot, with that small bow which is both apology and command, "I ask your patience for a demonstration. It will be short and it will be kind." Kindness is due the living and dignity the dead. The Countess inclined her head. Arthur set his jaw. Lady Evangeline's expression suggested courage, learned by consistent use. Dr. Percival cleared his throat with the discretion of a man who knows his cough can be misunderstood. Reverend Mallory folded his hands. Miss Vale, very still, watched the bell. "We will begin not with the word murder," continued Poirot softly, "but with the word arrangement. The late Earl loved arrangement, of ceremony, of silence, of others. It is fitting that his death too was arranged. A murmur stirred the air and died. On the night of the silent dinner, the Earl left the table at a little before 10. At 13 minutes past, the long case clock, the sentry of the corridor, stopped.
It did not stop by chance.
The wait was not exhausted. Mr. Price had wound it that morning. To stop a clock is a message. It tells the future that the past had its reasons. Poirot glanced at the clock upon the table, and with a delicate finger halted its pendulum.
You see?
So easy for one accustomed to clocks. Our household has such a person. Mr. Price's chin lifted a fraction. I wind them, sir, and I set them right. That is all. Just so, said Poirot. But on this night a clock was set deliberately wrong. He turned towards the family. Why? Because the guilty wished to write a time upon our memories, the hour at which the Earl was believed to have been alone. Arthur's hands tightened upon his knees. If you know who did it, say so. If you merely philosophize, ring the bell and we'll all go to bed. Poirot's eyes warmed. We will ring the bell in due course. For now, consider our second arrangement, the spoon. He lifted the dessert spoon from a velvet pouch, brought from the dining room earlier, and set it on a saucer. Upon this, he said, we find a residue, too small to taste, but sufficient to act. It was not upon the Countess's spoon, nor upon Mr. Arthur's, only upon that which lay to the right of the Earl's plate. The odour, you Hastings remarked, almond softened by sugar, belongs not to quince, but to chemistry. The bottle found in the scullery, its torn cork,
Nide, confirms the family. Dr. Percival exhaled with weary candour.
Cyanide, yes, the symptoms would be sudden and final. Merci, doctor. Now who has access to a spoon, to its place upon the table, and to the holy theatre of the dining room? A guest cannot move about without notice during a ritual of silence. A family member would not risk the scandal of being seen to fuss with the silver. But there is in every great household one who may rearrange what others hesitate to touch. This person moves like time, visible to none until time itself is absent. All eyes, almost against their owner's wishes, turned to Mr. Price. His expression did not change, but a muscle in the cheek gave the smallest twitch. Like a pendulum beginning, "You accuse me, sir," he said evenly.
On what ground?
For doing my duty at the table. Poirot did not smile. Not for doing your duty. For elevating it above goodness. He placed a hand upon the paper-wrapped silk. Our third arrangement, the bell. Steal a sound is to control a story. The Earl, returning to his study, would ring for Mr. Price, or for coffee, for witnesses, or for courage. It matters not. If the bell is absent, he must go without. If the spoon has already carried its kiss, he has no time to find another. Where do we find this bell? In the chapel font, baptized into silence.
Tell me, who in this house thinks of silence as purity?
Reverend Mallory's mouth tightened. You imply me. I imply your theology, said Poirot gently. Not your hands, the Reverend's gaze lowered. I spoke of mercy in silence. And you spoke sincerely, Poirot returned, and I saw Mallory release a breath he had not realized holding. Poirot lifted the silk and unfolded it. The handkerchief bears the monogram E.W. sewn with a fine, patient hand, Lady Evangeline perhaps, or Madame la Comtesse. Yet, in the corner, there is one stitch, not like the others. Hasty, crooked, the work of a hand determined to finish quickly. Why resew the edge? Because the fabric had been damaged by crystals, dried solution, yellowed, and the guilty wished to hide the stain. His eyes went to Mr. Price. A butler knows the laundry's language. He knows what a maid might notice in the morning. He removes the bell, wraps it in a handkerchief taken from the Earl's pocket, Earl Windmere, also E.W., or from the tray where such things lie. He dips it into the font to carry away the clinging scent. He rings no bell, he buries it. A long silence lay upon us, the kind that is not empty. At last the Countess spoke. "This is monstrous." Her voice was level, each word factored. "You would ruin a faithful servant to satisfy a theory." Poirot inclined his head towards her with evident respect. "Madame, I would prefer to ruin no one. But the arithmetic insists. It is not only the spoon, the clock, the bell. It is the motive." He turned to Arthur and Evangeline. "Your father meant to sign a codicil." He had delayed years.
Last night he meant to be brave.
The codicil would have lessened Arthur's inheritance, increased Evangeline's independence, given to the village, and provided for a child whom the Earl had hidden from scandal but wished no longer to starve of justice. Who in this house gains nothing by such changes? The one whose power depends upon the old arrangement, the keeper of keys, the manager of appearances, the guardian of tradition. Mr. Price's hands were neatly folded. He could have been a statue of itself. "You say I killed my master to preserve his household as it had been?" "I say," replied Poirot, "that you mistook order for virtue. Your loyalty was to the house, not to the truth. You would protect the legend even by destroying the man whose legend it was." For the first time, something entered Mr. Price's eyes, a glint like light striking a watch-glass. He looked not at Poirot, nor at the family, but at the bell, its little mouth dark within the paper cradle. "When his lordship married again," he said, very quietly, "he trusted me to keep the old standards. He said to me, 'Price, I cannot always be the Earl. You must be the Earl for me when I forget.' I kept that charge." "You speak of virtue."
"I speak of duty."
The codicil was not mercy, it was exposure. It would have set tongues wagging from the gatehouse to the bishop's ear. The village would have made a carnival of our shame.
"I could not permit it." Arthur stepped up as if to strike, then stopped, as if taught since childhood that rage is ultimately provincial.
"You presume to decide our fate." "I presume to spare my master what he feared most," Mr. Price returned, and now his voice shook, a tremor held to the level by training.
"Not death, humiliation." Poirot's tone softened.
"You loved him in your manner." "I respected him," said Mr. Price almost sharply. Then, after a moment, softer, "which is the only love I understood." "And so," Poirot continued, "you prepared the spoon in the scullery while the servants were in a ballet of service. You had an ounce bottle from a chemist, your own, perhaps borrowed under pretext of pest control. You placed the spoon at the Earl's setting, confident no one would speak in that ritual to notice a small rearrangement. You removed the bell beforehand and stopped the corridor clock after, so that the time should marry the silence. You took the handkerchief from his lordship's pocket when the doctor had closed his eyes, to be tidied, you would say, wrapped the bell, and hid it in the font that the scent might be washed and the symbol sanctified. Mr. Price's eyes closed, briefly as one who confesses an arithmetic mistake to himself. "It was wrong to use the font," he said.
"I see that now." The Countess's hand went to her throat.
"Price?" He looked towards her, towards all of them, not with plea, but with an extraordinary desolate propriety. "Your ladyship, I did as I believed right. To keep your world, that is, our world, from being dragged by the heels through the mud. If I erred, it was in thinking that mud can be kept out with polish." Reverend Mallory's voice, when it came, was not clerical, merely human. "You cannot take upon yourself the punishment of others' sins. It is not justice.
It is vanity dressed as sacrifice. And yet, Mr. Price murmured, someone must take it. Poirot moved the bell a fraction so that it caught the lamplight.
There is a debt, yes, he said, but not the one you think. The debt is paid by telling the truth, not by arranging it.
Your master meant to be brave last night.
You were brave in your way, but you chose the wrong courage. He turned a little, and his eyes found Dr. Percival. Doctor, you will confirm that the traces on the spoon and on the silk, tested, suffice to support what I say. Dr. Percival, who had earlier seen to the crystals and spoken with a professional's reluctance, nodded. Yes. And the typewriter, Poirot added almost tenderly, with its misaligned E and chipped R, tells us the codicil existed as Miss Vale described. It was no fantasy, only a document interrupted by silence. Miss Vale's face, hitherto a study in control, softened into grief. I tried to make him sign it before dinner. I begged. You had the better courage, Poirot said. Do not reproach yourself. Arthur spoke again, but the heat had gone from him, replaced by a bleak maturity that sat not unhandsome upon his features. What happens now? Now, Poirot said, we ring the bell. He placed it upon the table and with a finger touched it lightly. The sound that followed was small, bright, inevitable. It seemed to travel through the house and into its past, finding there the rooms that had longed to hear it. Mr. Price stood straighter, then bowed, first to the Countess, then to Arthur, then to Evangeline, and lastly to Poirot. I will go with Constable Rowley, he said. I ask only that the staff be not blamed for my arrangement. No one will be blamed, said the Countess, and to her credit there was in the words no trace of rancour, only fatigue and a species of love. As Mr. Price left, Reverend Mallory lifted his eyes. Dust thou art, he said again, but this time the words were neither resignation nor reproach, merely the admission that all our Polish ends in a simplicity we cannot arrange away. Poirot wound the clock and set it to the correct time. Order, he said to me under his breath, restored properly is only the face of truth. He turned to the family. There remains the codicil. If it is your will, it can still be signed in spirit, though the law will require its forms. The child should not be punished forever by the mistake of the old pride, nor the village which is innocent of our legends. The Countess, whose eyes shone now with something stern and fine, nodded once. We will do it. Arthur looked at his sister and then at Miss Vale. We will. Evangeline let her shoulders lower, and I saw in that small surrender the victory of a kind of grace. Poirot took up the bell again, examining the small coat of arms upon its curve. Silence, he said, more to himself than to us, is beautiful when it is voluntary. When it is forced, it becomes guilt's accent. He set the bell down. The house, hearing it, seemed to breathe again. Poirot's Journal, Windmere Hall, April 1932. The sea continues its accounts below the cliff, patient as ever. I have been thinking, in this small room where Hastings pretends not to snore, about the curious pride of the English. They make a virtue of silence. Sometimes they are right.
Often they are only comfortable. At Windmere, silence had become a uniform.
The late Earl wore it for many years, not only at the dinner once a year, but also in the little gestures that say, we do not speak of that. He thought he protected others. Perhaps he did then. But silence grows like ivy. It covers what is delicate and what is rotten with the same efficiency. Last night we cut ivy. I write not as the judge, but as the observer. Mr. Price, who killed his master, did so from that most complicated of motives, a devotion without love. He mistook the house for the family, the ritual for the soul. He wished to keep a legend intact. He forgot that legends are most powerful when they confess their errors. I have known criminals who sneered and criminals who cried. The most dangerous are those who believe they are good. For them, the end is always noble and the means always tidied. How small are the things that betray the grand design. A spoon, a bell, a stitch in a handkerchief, each an atom, together a universe. The little grey cells, they adore such astronomy. The stopped clock amused me. Its poetry was too neat. A clock that lies is like a man who quotes scripture only when he is wrong. There is also this matter of the child. Hastings, who is, as always, romantically loyal to whatever innocence is presented to him, hopes for a happy future.
I hope only for a just one.
The Countess will act. She has in her the firmness of a good steward when the play acting is over. Monsieur Arthur has discovered that to be a man is not to be obeyed, but to be accountable. This discovery pains him, but he will be better for it. Mademoiselle Evangeline has the particular courage of women who have learned to bear both the weight and the secrecy. As for Mademoiselle Vale, she will send a letter, or perhaps visit, and in either case the child will meet not a patroness but a friend. If the village speaks, let it speak. Speech is healthier than the silence they kept. I made a small observation to Hastings, which he has not yet written down, that duties are beautiful only when they serve persons, not reputations. Mr. Price served a reputation. When the bell rang this evening and he bowed and went away, he behaved like a perfect servant for the first time. He obeyed the truth. What remains?
Only this, I am tired of salt in the air.
We return to London tomorrow. I will trim my moustaches and instruct my tailor to bring me a waistcoat that does not complain. Hastings will insist upon paying for luncheon and will then forget his wallet.
I will forgive him, and he will forgive me for forgiving him.
The world will proceed with its arrangements, and now and then we will be asked to correct them, and so I close the journal for tonight. The house sleeps more honestly than it did. The sea speaks, the clock goes, the bell is not drowned. We are, for the moment, in order, and so even silence must one day confess. Candlelight, Mysteries, Channel Message, and that concludes tonight's mystery from Candlelight Mysteries, stories written in quiet homage to the golden age of detective fiction. In the Earl's silent dinner, we walked together through a house that believed silence could guard it forever. Perhaps we learned that truth, spoken gently, guards us better. If this tale kept you company, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts below. What detail caught your ear? Which moment surprised you? And where did you first suspect the truth? Your reflections help us tend the lamps in Poirot's world. Small lights, carefully kept, guiding us back to rooms of civility, courage, and human complexity. Each week, we gather here to unfold another story, sometimes grand, sometimes intimate, always told with care. It is a pleasure to spend these evenings with listeners who notice the quiet things, a misplaced object, a sudden pause, a sentence that turns out to be a clue. This little community of classic mystery lovers is the true inheritance we pass from episode to episode, a shared attentiveness, a gentleness of judgment, and a belief that reason can be tender. If you'd like to stay close to the firelight, you know the customs of our house, leave a note, join the conversation, or simply return next week for another candlelit case. By liking, subscribing, or joining our members' circle, you help us continue crafting these stories with care. But more than that, you remind us why we tell them. From all of us at Candlelight Mysteries, thank you for making space in your evening for a thoughtful detective, a loyal friend, and the small, luminous details that bring a world to life. Until next time, may your clocks keep honest time, may your bells ring clearly, and may your rooms be warmed by truth. Good night. Candlelight Mysteries.